In late 1941 and early 1942, the Pacific War moved rapidly from surprise to expansion. After the 7th of December, 1941, attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces captured Hong Kong on the 25th of December, advanced through Malaya, and took Singapore on the 15th of February 1942, overran most of the Dutch East Indies by early March, and pressed American and Filipino forces on Luzon and the southern Philippines into a prolonged defense that would end in April-May 1942. The Imperial General Headquarters sought to secure an outer defensive perimeter from the Aleutians through the Central and South Pacific to Burma, reduce Allied bases within that arc, and force a negotiated settlement by attrition. The United States aimed to protect sea lines to Australia, hold the Central Pacific with a limited carrier force, and prepare a counter-offensive once shipyards and training pipelines could restore strength. Within Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs discussed an early blow against the Japanese home islands to influence public morale, reassure allies, and impose political costs on Tokyo. Naval leaders assessed that carrier task forces could not yet risk a decisive fleet action near Japan, but might deliver a limited airstrike if aircraft with adequate range could launch from a carrier beyond coastal patrols, and then continue to friendly territory. Army Air Forces officers evaluated bomber types that could take off in several hundred feet, carry a modest bomb load over 600 to 800 nautical miles, and then fly onward to airfields in China. Soviet territory was excluded because the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of April 1941 constrained any plan that would end with crews landing in the USSR. The operational problem combined logistics and doctrine. U.S. carriers operated with compact air groups of shipboard aircraft. Standard Army bombers were heavier, lacked arresting gear, and could not recover to the deck. Preliminary estimates suggested that a medium bomber might be launched at sea if fueled to capacity and stripped of weight. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, an experienced test pilot and group commander from the U.S. Army Air Force's 17th Bombardment Group, was tasked to assess the B-25B Mitchell modifications, removed the ventral turret, reduced defensive guns, installed additional fuel tanks to extend total capacity beyond standard loads, and substituted a simplified bomb site for security trial takeoffs on short runways, replicated carrier deck lengths, and wind-over-deck conditions to validate feasibility. Chinese nationalist authorities agreed to receive aircraft and crews after the strike and to prepare emergency landing grounds in eastern China. This arrangement reflected overlapping aims. China sought visible American action against Japan and practical support for its long war. The United States needed recovery options and political cooperation on the ground. The arrangement also implied risks for Chinese civilians if Japanese forces chose to retaliate in the regions that would assist the raiders. Japanese planners, for their part, considered a direct American air attack on the home islands unlikely in early 1942. Naval and civilian coastal surveillance relied on picket vessels and patrols extending several hundred nautical miles from Honshu, reinforced by Army and Navy air units dispersed for training and home defense. Civil defense measures existed, but assumed sporadic reconnaissance or lone aircraft, not a coordinated raid launched from an American carrier force. Intelligence on both sides reflected partial visibility. U.S. naval cryptanalysis provided growing insight into Japanese operational movements in the broader theater, but the specific plan for a bomber launch from a carrier required strict compartmentalization and radio silence. Tokyo monitored American carrier activity across the Central Pacific, yet did not anticipate medium bombers appearing off the coast. Public sentiment shaped the timing. In the United States, newspapers tracked defeats in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and leaders sought a demonstrable action to signal eventual offensive intent. In Japan, media emphasized the consolidation of the perimeter and the distance of enemy bases, reinforcing assumptions that the home islands were beyond immediate reach. These political, logistical, and doctrinal conditions define the context in which a joint Army-Navy plan for a single raid using 16 B-25Bs, launched from a fleet carrier and recovered in China, moved from concept to preparation. On April 2, 1942, USS Hornet departed San Francisco Bay with 16 B-25B medium bombers lashed to her flight deck, each modified with extra fuel tanks, simplified bomb sights, and reduced defensive armament. Rear Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. led the covering force in USS Enterprise, bringing a composite task force of 2 fleet carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and support ships into the North Pacific. Captain Mark A. Mitcher commanded Hornet. Colonel James H. Doolittle commanded the Army Air Forces detachment, drawn from the 17th Bombardment Group. At sea, the 2 carriers rendezvoused and proceeded west under radio silence, zigzagging to avoid submarines and patrol lines. Command arrangements bridge service doctrines. Halsey retained operational control of the task force and its carrier air groups. Doolittle retained authority over the bomber's employment. Once airborne flight crews rehearsed deck procedures on a heaving ship, while Navy armorers prepared a mixed load of general-purpose and incendiary bombs, totaling roughly 2,000 pounds per aircraft. Enterprise fighters and scout bombers conducted anti-submarine and search patrols. Hornet's own air group was stowed below, its flight deck committed entirely to the Army aircraft. Fuel calculations assumed a launch point about 400 to 450 nautical miles from Japan, then a continuation to airfields prepared in eastern China. Japanese early warning depended on picket vessels and patrol aircraft deployed in arcs several hundred miles off Honshu. These auxiliaries, converted trawlers and small craft under Navy control, reported contacts by radio to regional commands responsible for civil defense alerts and the dispatch of Army or Navy fighters. Land-based radar existed in limited numbers, and coverage remained uneven. Given recent successes in Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific, planners judged a deep American carrier penetration into home waters unlikely before late spring. Before dawn on April 18th, the task force approached the planned launch area in poor visibility, with intermittent rain squalls and moderate seas. At approximately 650 to 750 nautical miles from the coast, the force encountered Japanese picket boats. A contact report was transmitted before Enterprise aircraft and surface guns disabled and sank several craft, including No. 23 Nidomaru. The prospect of additional reports reaching shore altered the risk calculus. Halsey signaled an early launch despite the greater distance to China, and worsening fuel margins. Doolittle conferred briefly with Mitcher and accepted the decision. Flight operations began shortly after 0800 local time. Enterprise turned into the wind to maximize wind over deck for Hornet. With carrier speed and prevailing wind combined, deck crews set chocks and signaled each bomber forward. Doolittle's aircraft rolled first, lifting off in a deck run of roughly 450 to 500 feet, followed in sequence by 15 more B-25Bs at intervals of about 1 to 2 minutes. Each crew faced the same constraints: heavy fuel load, no possibility of recovery to the carrier, and a navigation plan that required low-altitude approaches to assigned targets, then a climb to cruising altitudes for the transit toward China. On the American side, the decision sequence emphasized speed over ideal positioning, accepting higher probabilities of forced landings or fuel exhaustion after target attack. On the Japanese side, picket sightings activated coastal commands and civil defense procedures, but the precise origin, number, and type of approaching aircraft were not yet established. As the last bomber cleared Hornet's bow and the task force turned away at high speed, 2 carriers and their escorts receded into rain and low cloud, while 16 medium bombers flew west toward Honshu on diverging tracks aligned to pre-planned targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Kobe. Strategic intent diverged between services and nations. For Washington, objectives combined military experiment and political signaling. Demonstrate that a U.S. carrier force could project Army bombers to the Japanese home islands, impose limited damage on urban industrial targets, and raise Allied morale after losses in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. The Joint Chiefs approved a single-wave raid using 16 B-25s, accepting that aircraft would not return to the task force. For Tokyo, home defense aimed to preserve the perception of distance and safety. deter attacks by maintaining coastal patrol lines, and minimize disruption to war production and public order. Civil and military authorities coordinated air raid alerts, firefighting, and news controls, assuming sporadic threats from reconnaissance seaplanes or lone intruders rather than a formation launched at sea. Planning translated intent into constraints. The B-25B, normally carrying about 646 gallons of fuel, received additional tanks to raise capacity to roughly 1,100 to 1,140 gallons. Trading armor and some defensive armament for endurance standard bomb sites were removed for security and weight. Pilots trained to use a simplified device at low altitudes. Typical bomb loads were configured around 4 500-pound general-purpose bombs, sometimes with incendiary clusters intended for light industrial and dockside areas. Navigators prepared routes from a planned launch point approximately 400 to 450 nautical miles east of Honshu to targets around Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Kobe, then onward legs of 1,200 to 1,500 nautical miles to airfields in eastern China. Recovery plans identified several fields in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, with gasoline caches, beacons, and Chinese liaison teams for refueling and crew movement. Logistics synchronized a joint force. The U.S. Navy assembled Task Force 16 with 2 fleet carriers, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyers to deliver the bombers, maintain search screens, and withdraw at high speed. Hornet's flight deck was dedicated to the Army aircraft. Its organic air group remained below, limiting the carrier's own fighter availability. Enterprise covered the formation with fighter combat air patrols and anti-submarine patrols. Fuel consumption rates for the bombers dictated launch timing relative to forecast winds. Shipboard meteorological sections plotted a mid-April window with favorable deck winds but variable weather over the East China Sea and coastal China. Chinese nationalist authorities agreed to prepare landing grounds, clear approaches, and provide recovery support, understanding that Japanese retaliation in assisting regions remained a risk. Japanese preparations drew on layered systems rather than massed interceptor forces. Naval picket boats and patrol aircraft extended early warning arcs several hundred miles from the coast. Coastal radio nets fed reports to regional commands responsible for alarms and fighter dispatch. Anti-aircraft artillery defended key ports and industrial districts. With searchlights and civil defense units trained for blackout and firefighting, radar coverage existed but was limited in number and range, leaving gaps that patrol lines were intended to fill. Assumptions embedded in these measures, particularly that an American carrier group could not approach undetected to within a few hundred miles, shaped readiness levels. Miscalculations followed from these assumptions. U.S. planners underestimated the density and persistence of the picket screen and the likelihood of early contact beyond 600 nautical miles from Honshu. The recovery plan relied on weather forecasts that did not fully account for deteriorating conditions and nighttime arrival over eastern China, if launch occurred earlier or farther east than planned. Japanese staffs, conversely, discounted the possibility that land-based medium bombers would be launched from a carrier, and thus did not treat long-range twin-engine contacts as a probable threat profile. Both sides maintained strict radio discipline, which preserved operational surprise for the Americans, but also limited last-minute coordination with Chinese ground parties and constrained Japanese real-time aggregation of warning reports. Propaganda considerations framed expectations. In the United States, leaders aimed for a visible strike to offset recent defeats and to signal to allies that industrial recovery would be paired with offensive intent. In Japan, authorities prioritized continuity of production and public calm, anticipating that any raid, if it occurred, would be brief and containable. As the task force closed the coast on April 18th and picket sightings forced an earlier, more distant launch, the carefully balanced fuel margins for 16 aircraft and the layered but assumption-driven home defense system would intersect, setting conditions for the raid's execution and for the post-strike challenges on both sides. Shortly after midday on the 18th of April, 1942, the 16 B-25s crossed Japan's eastern coastline in small elements on pre-assigned headings toward Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Kobe crews navigated at low altitude, often between roughly 200 and 1,500 feet, to avoid radar and reduce exposure to interception, then climb modestly for bomb release. Typical loads combine 400 or 500-pound general-purpose bombs with small incendiary clusters aimed at oil storage, dock facilities, light industrial plants, and military installations. Doolittle's aircraft struck Tokyo first, followed within minutes by other teams attacking power stations, steel works, and rail yards in the metropolitan area, while separate elements hit Yokohama oil tanks, the Yokosuka Naval Base and Dry Dock, Nagoya aircraft and machine works, and Kobe port infrastructure. Japanese air raid networks activated local alarms as scattered picket reports and coastal observers confirmed intruders. Anti-aircraft batteries around key districts opened fire with light and medium calibers. Searchlights and barrage balloons offered limited effect in daytime conditions. Army and Navy fighters scrambled from nearby fields, but contact was inconsistent. Several B-25s reported brief pursuit or firing passes. None were confirmed destroyed over the targets, and most recorded only minor damage from fragments and small arms fire. Japanese reports initially claimed multiple attackers downed. Post-raid tallies adjusted these figures after no wreckage was found in the target zones. Bomb impacts produced short-duration fires and localized structural damage. Oil tanks in Yokohama ignited. Workshops and warehouses in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe sustained punctures, roof failures, and equipment loss. Rail movement paused in several districts during alerts. Civil defense units, fire brigades, police auxiliaries, factory squads conducted evacuation, fire break cutting, and water relay operations. Casualty counts varied by locality and source. Early Japanese summaries recorded dozens killed and more than 100 wounded across the 5 urban areas, while later, American assessments, based on translated reports, placed totals in the same order of magnitude. Damage to major heavy industrial complexes and naval construction capacity was limited. Work stoppages generally lasted hours to a day. For American crews, the immediate tactical outcome matched planning assumptions: brief time over target, no formation reassembly, and a turn to the southwest or west-southwest at low altitude, before climbing to fuel-efficient cruise for the long leg toward China. For Japanese commands, the first engagements exposed gaps between picket detection and coordinated interception, highlighted the challenge of identifying twin-engine intruders launched from an unexpected platform, and prompted immediate reviews of radar sighting, fighter readiness, and coastal screening. Civilians experienced the event through alarms, smoke columns, and disrupted transport rather than sustained bombardment. As the last B-25s cleared the urban belts and headed out over the Inland Sea and the East China Sea, the tactical phase over the home islands concluded, leaving both sides to manage the risks and consequences of the long return transit and the policy responses that would follow. Withdrawal and return created parallel crises at sea and ashore. After releasing bombs, the 16 B-25s turned toward China into headwinds and a weather front over the East China Sea. The early launch, roughly 200 to 300 nautical miles farther east than planned, reduced safety margins. Crews flew at economical power settings, jettisoned guns or excess equipment, and navigated on dead reckoning with limited radio use to conserve fuel. Cloud ceilings lowered through the afternoon. By evening, most crews faced rain, fog, and darkness, with coastal beacons in China obscured. No aircraft could return to the carriers. All aimed for emergency fields in Zhejiang and Jiangxi, or for coastal waters, where a ditching might allow survival near shore. At sea, Task Force 16 reversed course and withdrew at high speed, maintaining 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyers on anti-submarine screens. Japanese coastal commands reported intruders and picket losses. Search aircraft and surface units probed eastward, but failed to locate the American formation before nightfall. The risk calculus for both sides tightened. The U.S. Navy sought to avoid a carrier engagement near the home islands while low on fuel. Japanese staffs weighed the possibility of additional raids against the need to protect the fleet's main units during ongoing operations in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. Night arrivals produced forced landings. 15 aircraft reached the Chinese coast or interior, and either crash-landed on fields or mountainsides or had crews bail out. One aircraft, low on fuel, diverted north and landed in the Soviet Far East, where the crew was interned under the April 1941 Neutrality Pact. Of the 80 airmen who launched, most survived the landings. Some suffered injuries from parachute descents or impacts Chinese military units. Local officials and villagers organized ad hoc recovery, moving injured crewmen to safe houses and then to nationalist-controlled areas, while Japanese patrols intensified along probable routes. Japanese authorities initiated immediate security measures in occupied regions. Army units expanded checkpoints, searched suspected airfields, and interrogated travelers for reports of foreign airmen. Civil defense and police in the home islands compiled preliminary damage and casualty summaries and restored transport schedules to reduce economic disruption. In Nanjing and Hangzhou, Army commands alerted garrisons to prepare for punitive sweeps in districts believed to have assisted the raiders' escape. These early steps preceded larger operations, but already signaled a shift from coastal defense to internal security actions. Political pressures mounted. In Washington, the Navy reported the carrier's safe withdrawal, and the Army Air Forces confirmed that multiple urban targets had been struck. Officials prepared public statements that avoided operational details. In Chongqing, Chinese nationalist leaders publicized cooperation with American flyers as evidence of continued resistance and appealed for more supplies. In Tokyo, the Cabinet and Imperial General Headquarters coordinated messaging that emphasized minimal damage and the need to strengthen home defense, while intelligence staffs examined why picket warnings had not translated into timely interceptions. By 19th to 20th April, the immediate tactical phase had ended, but the crisis persisted. Scattered airmen were moving across eastern China with Chinese help. Japanese forces were organizing search and suppression, and both governments were assessing strategic implications. The raid's limited physical damage contrasted with the operational risks accepted by the U.S. Navy, the hazards faced by crews over unfamiliar terrain and poor weather, and the security response unfolding across occupied areas. The most intense phase unfolded weeks after the raid, when Japanese High Command converted shock into large-scale ground operations in China. From mid-May to early September 1942, elements of the China Expeditionary Army launched the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign to locate downed airmen, destroy airfields that might receive future raids, and punish local authorities who had assisted the crews. Forces drawn from the 11th and 13th Armies advanced on multiple axes from coastal bases toward inland towns such as Kuzhou, Lishui, Yushan, and Shangrao, employing infantry divisions with artillery and engineer regiments to seize river crossings and road junctions. Chinese nationalist units, regional corps under the 3rd and 9th War areas, mounted delaying actions, blowing bridges and withdrawing toward interior lines to preserve strength. The campaign scale, measured in tens of thousands of troops on each side, shifted the center of gravity from the brief air attack to sustained ground combat and security sweeps. High Command decisions reflected divergent priorities. Tokyo aimed to remove any Chinese air facilities within bomber ferry range of the home islands, and to deter collaboration with foreign forces. Orders authorized destruction of runways, fuel caches, radio beacons, and nearby depots, while intelligence detachments interrogated villagers and officials for traces of the raiders' movements. Chongqing prioritized extraction and concealment. Provincial governments moved American flyers by night through safe houses toward rear areas, while Chinese engineer units dispersed equipment from threatened fields. For the United States, the immediate operational peak had already passed at sea, but headquarters in Washington and Chongqing coordinated to recover crews and assess the feasibility of further long-range strikes via China. Civilian populations bore heavy costs as the ground campaign expanded. Japanese columns conducted searches in counties suspected of aiding the airmen. Local militias and police were disarmed. Food stores and transport animals were requisitioned to support the advanced towns along rail and road lines, experienced curfews and property inspections. Arrests increased where intelligence reports suggested foreign contact. Chinese authorities attempted partial evacuations of administrators and supplies from airfield zones, but the speed of the offensive forced many communities to shelter in place. The cumulative effect included widespread displacement, disruption of harvests, and heightened vulnerability to disease in areas where medical services had already been strained by years of war. Operationally, the campaign achieved immediate objectives. Airfields at Zhejiang, Lishui, and other sites were rendered temporarily unusable. Fuel dumps prepared for future ferry operations were destroyed, and several American airmen were captured during sweeps in late April and May. Strategically, however, the scale of effort in China signaled resource allocation choices, while the Navy pursued broader plans in the Central Pacific. The combined fleet, already formulating Operation MI to draw out U.S. carriers, treated the April attack as further justification for a decisive engagement in early June 1942. Within Japan, Home Defense Command arrangements were reviewed. Additional picket craft were assigned to coastal arcs. Anti-aircraft deployments around key ports were adjusted, and radar procurement plans received higher priority, though numbers remained limited. For Chinese forces, adaptation at the peak took the form of dispersion and deception. Engineers camouflaged runways with removable surface layers. Liaison teams established alternative beacon procedures using signal fires and portable radios, and guerrilla units mapped patrol patterns to route survivors around garrisons. For Japanese units, peak tempo manifested in riverline assaults and road-clearing operations against Chinese rearguards. Followed by methodical demolition of facilities, casualties rose on both sides as engagements multiplied across difficult terrain in summer heat. But the campaign remained defined less by set-piece battles than by sustained occupation measures and the systematic neutralization of infrastructure linked to the April raid. As September approached, front lines stabilized roughly where they had stood before the operation, with Japanese forces controlling key towns and lines of communication in the occupied zone, and Chinese units re-establishing positions in the interior. The campaign's intensity had accomplished its immediate military aims, denying specific air bases and capturing some participants, while imposing significant civilian hardship in contested provinces. Meanwhile, at the theater level, naval and political consequences of the April strike were converging with preparations for a major carrier engagement in the Central Pacific, setting conditions for subsequent shifts in momentum outside China. Adaptation unfolded across three interconnected arenas: home defense in Japan, coalition logistics in China, and American naval air doctrine. In the home islands, naval districts and Army air defense commands reassessed warning layers. Additional picket boats and auxiliary patrol craft were assigned to arcs several hundred miles offshore. Coastal radio nets standardized reporting formats to reduce delays between sighting and fighter scramble, and procurement plans for land-based radar sets expanded, though coverage remained incomplete through late 1942. Anti-aircraft deployments around port complexes at Tokyo, Bay, Nagoya, and Kobe were revised to thicken low to medium altitude fire, and fighter readiness cycles were shortened at fields within rapid reach of the metropolitan region. Civil defense bureaus intensified blackout enforcement, expanded neighborhood firefighting drills, and updated shelter signage near factories and rail nodes to minimize interruptions to production during alarms. In occupied eastern China, Chinese nationalist authorities and local networks adapted to the search pressure that followed the raid. Provincial officials dispersed caches along alternate routes rather than at airfields. Liaison teams shifted from fixed beacons to portable radios and visual signals, and guerrilla bands mapped Japanese patrol habits to move personnel across river lines. These measures aided the movement of most American survivors. Of the 80 airmen who launched, 69 ultimately reached friendly territory in China with local assistance, while 8 were captured by Japanese forces during sweeps, and 1 crew of 5 landed in the Soviet Far East, and was interned under the Neutrality Pact before being allowed to exit via Iran in 1943. Resource scarcity shaped choices. Gasoline stocks earmarked for emergency landings were rapidly consumed or destroyed. Medical supplies were rationed as villages took in wounded flyers, and transport animals replaced trucks on threatened roads to avoid checkpoints. Japanese countermeasures in China emphasized systematic denial. Engineer units cratered runways and burned nearby depots. Gendarmerie detachments expanded informant networks, and rail security tightened on trunk lines from Hangzhou and Nanchang. Captured American personnel were interrogated about routes, contacts, and future plans. Judicial outcomes reflected the punitive arc of occupation policy. 3 captured airmen were executed in October 1942 after military trials. 1 died in imprisonment in 1943. 4 survived in captivity until 1945. These measures, while achieving localized control, required sustained troop commitments during a period when Army resources were also needed for operations elsewhere in Asia. American doctrine incorporated lessons at multiple levels. The Navy reinforced the principle that carriers should avoid predictable approaches to defended coastlines and that picket detection could occur hundreds of miles out. Search arcs were widened and anti-submarine patrol patterns adjusted on ingress and egress. The Army Air Forces refined medium bomber fuel planning for overwater legs, standardized short-run takeoff techniques, and codified emergency bailout and evasion procedures for operations requiring recovery in contested territories. Strategically, planners concluded that repeat medium bomber raids via China were not sustainable given weather, fuel, and interception risks. Instead, long-range bombardment capability would transition to heavy bombers operating from new bases, a concept that would only be realized with B-29s in 1944. Psychological and organizational effects were managed deliberately. In the United States, training commands used the operation to reinforce navigation, fuel economy, and joint procedures without promising similar missions. In Japan, public messaging emphasized continuity of production and the strengthening of defenses, while internal directives pressed for faster, more integrated warning-to-intercept cycles. In China, propaganda celebrated local aid to foreign flyers to bolster morale and encourage cooperation with Allied liaison teams, even as authorities cautioned villages about the risks of assisting personnel in regions under active search. By late 1942, the initial shock had been converted into routines. Coastal screens operated with more standardized reporting. Chinese rescue corridors used smaller, more mobile nodes, and American staffs redirected long-range strike ambitions toward new basing concepts. The adaptations did not erase the vulnerabilities revealed in April, but they redistributed risk through procedure, dispersion, and revised expectations on all sides. The operational turning point unfolded not in April, but in the planning cycle that followed. In late April-May 1942, combined fleet staff completed orders for a 2-pronged operation, MI against Midway Atoll and AL against the Aleutians, scheduled for early June. The April raid reinforced arguments inside the Navy that destroying the remaining U.S. carrier force was urgent, and that a forward picket barrier alone could not protect the home islands. Tokyo also directed additional home defense allocations, picket craft, anti-aircraft moves, and radar procurement, diverting some resources from other theaters. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs weighed the raid's morale effect alongside intelligence gains from code breaking, which indicated Japanese interest in AF, assessed as Midway. The United States concentrated 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the repaired Yorktown, plus land-based aircraft on Midway, treating June as an opportunity to contest sea control rather than to repeat a bomber launch. Causation was indirect but measurable. The April attack did not dictate the MI concept, which predated it, yet it strengthened the case to accelerate timing, include a diversion to the Aleutians, and draw U.S. carriers into battle away from Hawaii. The diversion split Japanese strength across northern and central axes. Home defense reviews continued in parallel, but the decisive test moved to the Central Pacific. Between 4 and 7 June 1942, the opposing forces converted these choices into losses. Japan committed 4 first-line carriers under 1st Air Fleet. The United States brought 3 fleet carriers with Midway's Marine and Navy air groups. Outcomes were asymmetrical. Japan lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with roughly 248 carrier aircraft and large portions of trained air crews. The United States lost Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond with about 150 aircraft destroyed. On personnel, Japanese fatal casualties numbered several thousand across the carriers and escorts. U.S. deaths were in the hundreds. The strategic balance of carrier aviation shifted as Japan's pilot and deck crew losses proved difficult to replace at the same rate as U.S. shipyard and training expansion. For China, the turning point took a different form. The April strike triggered the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, which from May to September neutralized multiple airfields and punished communities suspected of aiding airmen. While this achieved short-term denial of bases, it also stretched occupation forces and hardened local resistance networks that later facilitated intelligence collection and air-ground cooperation with Allied missions. For the United States, the raid concluded as a singular method. Planners did not schedule further medium bomber launches from carriers. Long-range pressure on the home islands shifted to heavy bombers once bases could be established, a concept realized only with B-29 operations in 1944. Domestic interpretations reflected each state's priorities. In Japan, public messaging emphasized limited damage from April and framed Midway operations as part of a broader plan to secure the perimeter. Post-June communications managed the impact of carrier losses without divulging full details. In the United States, leaders presented the April strike and the June battle as linked evidence of offensive capability. But operationally, the link rested on intelligence, logistics, and opponent decision-making, rather than on a repeatable tactic. The turning point, therefore, lay in how a single raid interacted with pre-existing plans to hasten a decisive carrier engagement, which, once fought, reweighted the naval air war and reshaped options for all sides. By late April 1942, the carriers had returned to Pearl Harbor, ending the naval phase. All 16 B-25s were lost by crash landing, bailout, or internment. None recovered to the task force. Of the 80 airmen who launched, 69 reached Chinese-controlled territory and were evacuated over weeks through nationalist lines. 8 fell into Japanese hands, and 3 were killed during the mission by drowning or impact. The crew that landed in the Soviet Far East was interned under the April 1941 Neutrality Pact and later exited via Iran in 1943 through a controlled transfer arranged by Soviet authorities. American survivors were dispersed for debriefing, training assignments, and public events supporting war bond drives, while operational reports documented aircraft performance, fuel margins, and navigation errors to refine future overwater planning. Japanese authorities compiled damage assessments indicating short-duration fires, localized infrastructure loss, and brief transport interruptions across the target areas. Initial shoot-down claims were reduced after post-raid searches found no bomber wreckage in the home islands. Civil defense bureaus updated blackout protocols and firefighting readiness. Naval districts strengthened picket arcs and adjusted anti-aircraft deployments. And procurement offices advanced radar orders. Press guidance presented the event as a limited intrusion with minimal effect on war production, while internal memoranda emphasized the need to accelerate defensive modernization. In China, the aftermath extended into a multi-month campaign. From May to September 1942, Japanese forces conducted the Zhejiang-Jiangxi operation, destroying airfields and depots linked to possible future raids and searching for downed airmen. Chinese nationalist armies attempted to hold river lines and delay columns. Guerrilla groups facilitated evasion routes for foreigners and Chinese officials. Civilian costs were severe. Contemporary Chinese records and post-war studies estimate civilian deaths from reprisals, disease, and displacement in the tens of thousands to over 200,000 across affected provinces, with large variance by source and method of estimation. Agricultural losses and infrastructure destruction reduced local output for subsequent seasons, complicating nationalist supply efforts. Captured American personnel underwent interrogation and military trial. In October 1942, 3 were executed. 1 died in imprisonment in 1943. 4 survived to liberation in 1945. The legal framework cited by occupation authorities treated the attacks and post-landing movements as violations. American and Chinese governments protested the executions as contrary to laws of war. These outcomes reinforced Allied planning assumptions about the risks of operations that depended on recovery in occupied territory. In the United States, the government publicized the strike's occurrence while withholding operational specifics. All participants received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Select Chinese civilians and military facilitators were later recognized by Allied commands. James H. Doolittle received the Medal of Honor and promotion, with the citation emphasizing leadership under uncertain fuel conditions and an untested launch method. Public messaging linked the April raid to broader themes of eventual offensive action, but military staff treated it as a unique demonstration rather than a repeatable tactic. Strategically, Japanese Navy planners used the raid to support arguments for engaging U.S. carriers at a time and place of their choosing, contributing to the early June Midway Plan alongside pre-existing objectives against AF. Army commands in China pursued denial operations that neutralized specific bases and routes, but required sustained garrisons and transport security in contested regions. For Chongqing, cooperation with the raiders showcased Allied partnership and justified requests for additional material support, even as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign strained provincial administrations and displaced populations that nationalist logistics then had to assist. Operational lessons were codified. U.S. carrier doctrine emphasized unpredictability of approach vectors and the exposure created by picket screens far from the coast. Army Air Force's manuals incorporated short-deck takeoff techniques, overwater fuel planning, and standardized evasion procedures. Japanese home defense directives compressed the sequence from sighting to interception and expanded training for joint Army-Navy air defense, while the Navy examined the allocation of scout planes and auxiliary craft to close offshore gaps. Chinese forces institutionalized clandestine movement corridors and communications procedures that would later aid air-ground coordination with Allied missions. By autumn 1942, the immediate aftermath had resolved into enduring adjustments, strengthened Japanese home defense and occupation security. Allied doctrines shifts away from carrier-launched medium bombers toward heavy bomber concepts contingent on new bases, and Chinese networks that balance publicized cooperation with the risks of collective punishment. The raid's tactical results remained limited, but its aftermath, spanning legal cases, reprisals, propaganda, and force employment choices, reached into multiple theaters and influenced how each belligerent weighed cost, risk, and political effect in the next phases of the war. The raid's legacy combined operational lessons, political effects, and contested memory. For the United States, it validated that fleet carriers could project unexpected strike profiles and cooperate with land-based aircraft. But it also confirmed limits. Medium bombers launched from carriers were not a repeatable method. Subsequent strategies shifted toward building fast carrier task forces for sustained operations and fielding heavy bombers from fixed bases. By 1944, long-range attacks on Japan proceeded with B-29s from the Marianas and, earlier, from Chinese bases under XX Bomber Command, reflecting a move from symbolic penetration to sustained air campaigns. Within Japan, the event accelerated home defense reforms. Naval districts extended picket arcs, standardized radio reporting, and pressed for additional radar sets. Army and Navy air commands refined interception timelines and redistributed anti-aircraft units around key ports. These measures did not eliminate vulnerability, but tightened procedures that later shaped responses to carrier raids in 1944 to 1945. Strategically, naval staff used the April attack among the arguments for drawing out U.S. carriers, a factor that intersected with pre-existing plans and contributed to the June 1942 decision to fight at Midway. Analysts continue to debate the degree to which the raid influenced timing and force allocation versus other intelligence and planning drivers. In China, the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign left a durable imprint on local societies and on Allied rescue doctrine. The destruction of airfields and reprisals against suspected collaborators underscored the risks when operations depended on recovery in occupied territory. Chinese authorities integrated lessons into clandestine movement networks and communications procedures that later supported air-ground cooperation and downed airman recovery across multiple provinces. The episode also featured in Chinese narratives of joint resistance, while highlighting the humanitarian costs borne by civilians in contested regions. Legal and humanitarian consequences extended after the war. Trials in post-war tribunals addressed the treatment of captured American personnel, producing convictions and sentences for officers involved in executions and mistreatment. These proceedings reinforced evolving interpretations of the laws of war regarding aircrew who operate over civilian areas and then evade through occupied territory. For American forces, survival manuals and evasion training were updated to include guidance on movement in hostile regions, contact protocols with local populations, and expectations for interrogation and captivity. Culturally, the raid entered public memory through publications, films, and veterans' commemorations. In the United States, narratives emphasized technical improvisation, joint service coordination, and the limited physical damage relative to the political signal. Surviving participants were honored with decorations, including the Medal of Honor for James H. Doolittle, and maintained reunions that became part of wartime remembrance. Japanese public memory evolved from wartime censorship toward post-war scholarship examining civil defense, intelligence assessments, and the interaction between the April event and subsequent strategic choices. In China, memorials and local histories document assistance to airmen alongside accounts of the 1942 campaign's impact on communities. Historiographically, 3 debates persist. First, how to weigh the raid's contribution to Allied morale and deterrence relative to its material effects, given that industrial disruption in April 1942 was brief and localized. Second, how to calibrate causality between the raid and Midway, whether April primarily accelerated a plan already chosen or substantively altered its scope and diversion. Third, how to represent the balance between the raid's symbolic value and the civilian costs generated by subsequent security operations. In occupied China scholarship addressing these questions increasingly draws on American, Japanese, and Chinese sources to align casualty figures, operational orders, and propaganda with observed outcomes. Measured against the war's later scale, the raid was small in aircraft and munitions, 16 B-25Bs, roughly 64 500-pound bombs when fully loaded across the force, but outsized in political and doctrinal impact. It demonstrated that surprise could be produced through service integration and platform improvisation. It prompted defensive adaptations around Japan, and it influenced Allied movement toward heavy bomber basing and fast carrier doctrine. Its legacy is therefore twofold: an operational case study in risk acceptance and joint planning, and a reminder that tactical actions can redirect resources, reshape expectations, and leave humanitarian consequences that extend far beyond the event's brief duration.